I understand it is the intention of the government to introduce the bill.
Legislation Amendment Bill, introduction.
The bill is set down for first reading forthwith.
Mr Speaker.
Just before I call the Honourable Dr Nick Smith, I do just want to point out to members that clocks have been added as a guidance to members. They will show the speaking time remaining. While they are there as a guide to members, ultimately the presiding officers will have complete discretion as to when to start a speech and when a speech concludes. I apologise for interrupting the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I move that the Housing Legislation Amendment Bill be now read a first time. Mr Speaker, this bill is about ensuring a smooth transition to the Auckland Unitary Plan. It is about extending the toolbox of special housing areas to regional New Zealand, and it is about making the law clear in respect of government housing programs on publicly owned land. Mr Speaker, I do find it ironic that members of the Labour opposition, who over the recess have been crying for a state of emergency over the issue of housing, are now saying no, they don't want to vote on a bill that will make a material difference. Could you get some water? Mr Speaker, this bill builds on the very substantive work of the Productivity Commission. In 2012, its report concluded overwhelmingly that our land use planning system was at the core of New Zealand's issues in respect of housing. I note that since 1990, the increase in house land costs in Auckland have gone up by 350% as compared with inflation of 71% and building costs of 78%. Mr Speaker, those figures make very plain that it is the issue of land use planning that is at the core of the challenges around housing affordability in Auckland. There was a huge dysfunctionality between the regional council and the district councils and city councils in Auckland that were not able to agree on whether Auckland should go up or out. And so the very first and important step we made as a government was merging Auckland into a single council and requiring them to develop a single plan. Mr Speaker, the process of writing a plan for the City of Auckland would normally take a period of 7 or 8 years, noting it would be the largest plan in New Zealand history, covering over 500,000 properties. It is actually a tribute to Mayor Len Brown, his Deputy Penny Hulse, the Independent Hearings Panel and the Auckland Council that they have successfully concluded that process, and next Friday Auckland will have a new plan, one that succeeds rules that were written more than 20 years ago. Now, Mr Speaker, we walked a fine line between the legislation of ensuring that process occurred as quickly as possible while also ensuring people had a fair say, and we determined that in the interim housing could not stand still, and that's why we made provision for special housing areas. 154 of those have been approved. 1,342 houses were built and completed by the end of June. 2,208 building consents have been approved, and resource consents for 6,700 sections have been approved. Mr Speaker, it's interesting to note that in the last 12 months there would have been no growth in the number of residential consents and new homes built if it was not for the extra 1,100 that came through the special housing areas process, and that pipeline is growing, as evidenced by the fact that in the first year it was 6%, the second year it was 9%, it is now 14%, next year it's scheduled to be over 20%, and the year following 30%. Mr. Speaker, that brings me to the key provisions that are provided for in this bill. The first issue is around transitioning from those special housing areas over to the new unitary plan. Of those 154 special housing areas, there are 8 of which there is doubt as to whether the plan change process will be concluded by next Thursday. And without this bill, those 8,000 homes would not be able to progress. Now, Mr. Robertson interjects, when did we know that? Well, actually, we still don't absolutely know, because there are independent hearings panels that are independent and are currently considering housing in those areas. Equally so, we did not know until the unitary plan process was complete, because we would not know what areas had been zoned residential. What this bill does is ensure that those 8,000 homes can proceed, and I note that those provisions have the very strong support of the Auckland Council, and I would say to members of this House, if you are genuinely concerned about housing issues in Auckland, why would we send those 8 significant developments for 8,000 homes back to the beginning of the process? Now, Mr. Speaker, when we brought the special housing areas process to the Parliament, it was very controversial. There was concern in local government. What is interesting is that I have had a number of letters from councils around the country, like Queenstown, my meetings last week in the Bay of Plenty, meetings in Christchurch, and also in areas such as Auckland and my own constituency, where local government recognises the pressures they now have in their areas around housing. And while they are supportive of the government's additional programs of work, the RMA reform, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, the Urban Development Authority, they want to make progress now, and they want the tools of the Special Housing Area Act extended, and that is the second part of this bill that will enable those accords to be extended for local government and central government to work together on providing additional housing supply and having access to those fast-track methods for bringing in new housing supply. Mr. Speaker, in amending those special housing areas, the only change in the provision is to put extra pressure on the landowner to require that plan changes and resource consents are lodged within 12 months, and there is a further minor amendment to simply make the process less bureaucratic and to allow those identified special housing areas to be divided by a plan and the plan description rather than just a description specifically of the title. Now, the third and final issue that's covered in this bill is the issue of the Housing Act and the way in which it is able to bring new houses on stream. That's important. Biggest housing development in New Zealand is in Hobsonville, which is former defence land. If we look at the Weymouth development, which I think every member of this House would say is a great initiative, it was the first special housing area, it's also surplus Crown land. Now, the difficulty is that governments for generations have assumed that when there is a housing development under the Housing Act, that it would not trigger the offer-back provisions. How do we know that? Because governments and ministers on Labor's side of the House, on this side of the House, whenever they have sold properties coming from such developments, have not triggered those offer-back provisions. The clear advice is that it was never intended that the offer-back provisions would apply where there was a housing development under the Housing Act. This bill provides clarity in that area of law, and it's important to Weymouth, it's important to Hobsonville, because it provides the certainty that we're able to partner with the private sector and ensure that we continue to grow that important pipeline of new housing. Mr. Speaker, every member of this House knows that there is pressure on housing. The truth is that New Zealand's population is growing faster than at any time in our history. That's because people are voting with their feet confidence in New Zealand and confidence in this government. But that equally puts an onus on us, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we build as many houses as we can and to remove any legislative or bureaucratic impediment to more houses being built. And that's why I challenge every member of this House to support new houses, more houses for New Zealanders, because this bill, this urgency, is a test as to whether members want to play politics or whether they want to support more houses being built for Kiwi families.
And the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well,